You are worthless. I do not need you anymore, you worthless woman. Jason's voice did not just echo through our living room in Fort Wayne, Indiana. It tore through the air like a physical weapon. I watched in a state of paralyzed horror as he threw my suitcase down the front steps. The heavy bag tumbled end over end. It struck the hardwood floor with a sickening thud that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. That sound marked the violent end of my life as I knew it. I stood there at the top of the landing. I was stunned. My body refused to move. I was watching 15 years of marriage crumble into dust in the span of 10 minutes. My face was still hot and stinging from the tears I had been shedding since he had started packing my belongings. He had moved with the terrifying enthusiasm of someone finally getting rid of unwanted clutter. He looked like a man cleaning out a garage rather than a husband ending a partnership. My name is Sarah. I am 38 years old. I never imagined I would find myself homeless because my husband had suddenly decided he was too good for me. Arthur, his father, had passed away just 3 days earlier. The funeral flowers had barely wilted on the grave. Yet Jason was already acting like he owned the world. He stood in our doorway with his face flushed red with excitement. It was a manic and ugly look that I had never seen before. I am rich now, Sarah. $75 million. He shouted the number as if it were a magic spell that erased our past. I do not need some waitress dragging me down anymore. I am going to live like a king. The cruelty in his voice cut deeper than any physical blow could have. It was not just the volume of his voice. It was the dismissal. It was the complete erasure of my humanity. For 15 years, I had worked double shifts at Miller's Diner to keep us afloat. I had done this while Jason bounced between part-time jobs. He always claimed he was finding himself or waiting for the right opportunity. I had paid our mortgage. I had bought our groceries. I had even covered his car payments when his employment was inconsistent, which was most of the time. Jason, please. I whispered the words. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I looked down at the suitcase at the bottom of the stairs. We have been together for 15 years. Does that not mean anything to you? He laughed. It was a harsh and metallic sound that made my stomach turn. It means I wasted 15 years being held back by someone who was not good enough for me. Arthur always knew I would amount to something great. That is why he left me everything. I looked into his eyes. I searched for the man I had married. I searched for the boy who had once promised to take care of me. But that man was gone. In his place stood a stranger, consumed by greed. I felt a strange and terrifying sensation wash over me. It was a feeling of lightness. It was not the lightness of relief. It was the lightness of being unmoored. I felt like an astronaut whose tether had been cut. I was drifting away into a cold and dark void. I was being discarded. I was being thrown away like a wrapper from a piece of candy he had finished eating. Then he did something that broke the last fragment of my heart. He stepped forward and grabbed my left hand. His grip was painful. His fingers dug into my skin with unnecessary force. And I will be taking this back. He snarled the words as he reached for my wedding ring. I tried to pull back. I was too shocked to fight him physically. He twisted the gold band off my finger. It scraped over my knuckle. The friction burned my skin. You do not deserve to wear this. I bought this ring. It belongs to me. The lie hung in the air between us. It was so audacious that I almost laughed. I remembered the day he had bought that ring. He had used his credit card. But I remembered the months that followed even more clearly. I remembered the extra shifts I took on Tuesday nights. I remembered standing on my feet for 12 hours a day serving coffee and eggs to pay off the bill because Jason had quit his job at the warehouse 2 weeks after the proposal. I paid for that ring, Jason. I managed to choke out the words. My voice was thin and trembling. I paid every single cent of the bill for that ring while you sat on the couch playing video games. He sneered at me. He shoved the ring into his pocket. It was my credit card, Sarah. That makes it mine. You were just paying rent for the privilege of being my wife. But the lease is up. He pointed toward the door. His finger was like a loaded gun. Get out. I looked at the empty space on my finger. The skin was pale where the gold had sat for a decade and a half. It felt naked. It felt exposed. The symbolism was devastating. He had stripped me of my home. He had stripped me of my future. Now he had stripped me of the symbol of our past. I walked down the stairs. My legs felt like lead. I picked up the suitcase. It was heavy. It contained only a fraction of my life. The rest of my things were still upstairs in the closet. My books were on the shelves. My winter coat was in the hall. But I knew I would never see them again. I walked to the door. I did not look back at him. I could hear his heavy breathing behind me. It was the sound of a predator who had just won a fight. As I stepped out onto the porch, the cool Indiana air hit my face. It was a gray afternoon. The sky was the color of slate. I walked down the sidewalk toward my car. It was a 10-year-old sedan with a dent in the rear bumper. It was the car I had used to drive Arthur to his chemotherapy appointments. It was the car I had used to drive Arthur to the grocery store. Behind me, I heard the front door open again. I flinched. I expected him to throw something else at me. "Do not come back, Sarah." Jason shouted the words for the whole neighborhood to hear. Mrs. Gable next door pulled her curtains back. I saw her face pressed against the glass. She was watching my humiliation. "I am rich, I am free, and you are nothing." The door slammed shut. The sound echoed down the quiet suburban street. It was final. It was absolute. I stood by my car door. My hand rested on the cold metal handle. I was 38 years old. I had $43 in my wallet. I had no home. I had no husband. I had just been erased. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was final. It was a sharp and mechanical click that severed the last artery connecting me to the life I had built. I stood on the concrete porch. The cold seeped through the soles of my thin work shoes. I stared at the wood grain of the door. I knew that door better than I knew my own face. I had painted it myself 3 years ago. I had sanded down the rough spots and applied 3 coats of varnish to protect it from the Indiana winter. I had polished the brass knocker until it gleamed like gold. Now that door was a barrier. It was a fortress wall erected to keep me out. This was Arthur's house. It was never truly ours. We had moved in after Jason lost his job at the warehouse because he could not afford rent on our apartment. But I had made it a home. I had scrubbed the grout in the bathroom until my knuckles bled. I had planted the hydrangeas lining the walkway. I had filled these rooms with the smell of roasting chicken and fresh coffee to mask the scent of sickness that had permeated the walls during Arthur's final months. The silence that followed the slamming door was heavy. It pressed against my eardrums. Inside my head, however, the echo of Jason's voice was still screaming. Theodore always knew I would amount to something great. The words bounced around my skull. They were a cruel joke. Arthur had known nothing of the sort. I remembered the look in Arthur's eyes when Jason would sleep until noon. I remembered the disappointment etched into the old man's face when Jason refused to help him up the stairs. Yet here I was locked out, and Jason was inside celebrating a victory he had not earned. A cold wind swept down the street. It cut through my cardigan. I shivered. But the cold I felt deep in my bones had nothing to do with the weather. I looked down at my hands. They were red and chapped from years of scrubbing dishes at the diner and washing sheets for an invalid. I was 38 years old. The number hit me with the force of a physical blow. 38. I was not 22. I was not a young girl starting out with the world at her feet and time on her side. I was a middle-aged woman. I was a woman who had invested 15 prime years of her life into a partnership that had just declared bankruptcy. I had no degree, I had no savings. I had no career ladder to climb. I had a resume that listed 15 years of waitressing and caregiving. In the eyes of the corporate world, I was invisible. In the eyes of the dating world, I was damaged goods. The panic began to rise in my chest. It was a primal and suffocating fear. It was the terror of the displaced. I felt like a piece of furniture that had gone out of style. Jason had decided to redecorate his life with his new millions, and I was the old couch being hauled to the curb. What does a woman do when she is discarded at 38? The question looped in my mind. I had defined myself as a wife. I had defined myself as a caregiver. I had defined myself as the strong one who held the family together. Now those titles were stripped away. Without them, who was I? Was I just a homeless waitress with a suitcase full of old clothes? The shame of it was hot and acidic in my throat. I felt exposed. I felt like I was standing naked on the front lawn. I sensed movement in the periphery of my vision. I turned my head slightly. In the window of the house to the left, I saw the curtains twitch. Mrs. Gable was watching. I could imagine her squinting through her bifocals. She was witnessing the fall of Sarah Harrison. By tomorrow morning, the entire neighborhood would know. They would whisper over their fences. They would say that Jason finally kicked her out. They would speculate about what I had done to deserve it. They would never guess that my only crime was being poor while my husband became rich. The humiliation was worse than the fear. I had always held my head high. Even when we were broke, even when Jason was unemployed, even when I was exhausted from double shifts, I had maintained my dignity. I had kept our lawn manicured. I had waved to the neighbors. I had pretended that everything was fine. Now the facade was shattered. I was the woman standing on the sidewalk with her life packed into a single bag. I was the cliché of the unwanted wife. I could not stay here. I could not let them see me cry. I gripped the handle of my suitcase. My knuckles turned white. I forced my legs to move. One step, then another. I walked down the concrete path I had swept just yesterday. I reached the sidewalk and turned toward the driveway. My car sat there like a sad gray beast. It was a 10-year-old sedan with a rusted wheel well and a dent in the rear bumper. This was the chariot of my existence. This was the car I had used to drive Arthur to his physical therapy appointments 3 times a week. This was the car that smelled of the peppermint candies Arthur liked to suck on during the drive. This was the car where I had listened to Arthur's stories about building his empire while Jason played video games at home. I reached for the door handle. It was cold and gritty with road dust. I pulled it open. The hinge groaned in protest. It was a sound of exhaustion that matched my own. I lifted my suitcase. It was heavy with the weight of my past. I shoved it into the back seat. It landed on a pile of old blankets I had kept there to wrap around Arthur's legs on cold mornings. Seeing those blankets caused a fresh wave of pain. They were plaid wool. Arthur had loved them. Now they were just rags in the back seat of a homeless woman's car. I climbed into the driver's seat and closed the door. The silence inside the car was absolute. It smelled of old upholstery and stale coffee. I put the key in the ignition, but I did not turn it. I just sat there. I gripped the steering wheel until my hands hurt. I looked up at the house one last time. The light in the living room window was glowing warmly. It looked so inviting. It looked like a home. But it was a lie. Inside that warm light was a monster who had just consumed 15 years of my life and spit out the bones. I am not worthless. I whispered the words to the empty car. I needed to hear them aloud. I am not worthless. But as I looked at my face in the rearview mirror, I saw the terror in my own eyes. I saw a woman who was 38 years old and completely alone. The reflection stared back at me. It asked a question I could not answer. Where do we go from here? I turned the key. The engine sputtered and then roared to life. It was a rough and ugly sound. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the driveway. I did not look at Mrs. Gable's window. I did not look at the front door where I had left my marriage. I fixed my eyes on the road ahead. It was gray and stretching out into nothingness. I drove away from the only life I had known, leaving behind the ghost of the woman I used to be. The neon sign of the Budget Inn flickered with a rhythmic buzzing sound that seemed to mock the pounding headache behind my eyes. It was a place where people went when they had run out of options. The lobby smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial lemon cleaner. The clerk behind the bulletproof glass had barely looked up from his phone as he slid a plastic key card across the counter. He did not ask why a woman dressed in sensible work clothes was checking in alone with a single suitcase at 4 p.m. He did not care. In a place like this, nobody asked questions because nobody wanted to hear the answers. I unlocked the door to room 112. The air inside was heavy and stagnant. The carpet was a shade of brown that was designed to hide stains. The bedspread was a garish floral pattern that had faded decades ago. I walked to the small round table by the window and set my purse down. My hands were trembling again. It was a fine tremor that started in my fingers and worked its way up my arms. I sat down on the edge of the bed. The mattress sagged deeply under my weight. It felt like the room was trying to swallow me whole. I took a deep breath and reached for my wallet. I needed to know exactly where I stood. I needed to confront the mathematics of my disaster. I opened the leather clasp and dumped the contents onto the bedspread. There was a crumpled receipt from the grocery store where I had bought Arthur's favorite oatmeal just yesterday. There was a loyalty card for a coffee shop I would probably never visit again. And there was the money. I smoothed out the bills. 3 $10 bills, 2 $5 bills, 3 $1 bills, $43. I stared at the green paper faces of the presidents. They looked back at me with indifference. $43 was not enough for a tank of gas. It was not enough for 2 nights at this terrible motel. It was certainly not enough to start a new life. It was a terrifyingly small number. It was the sum total of my existence. Panic began to claw at my throat. I grabbed my cell phone. I needed to call Jason. Not to beg, not to ask for reconciliation. I needed to talk about logistics. We had a joint checking account. My paycheck from Miller's Diner was deposited there every 2 weeks. That money belonged to me. I had earned it by carrying heavy trays and tolerating rude customers. He could not just lock me out of my own earnings. I dialed his number. My heart hammered against my ribs as I listened to the ringtone. 1 ring, then silence. The call ended abruptly. I stared at the screen. I tried again. This time it did not even ring. It went straight to a generic automated message. The subscriber you are trying to reach is not available. He had blocked me. I lowered the phone slowly. The screen turned black. In that dark reflection, I saw the face of a fool. I had trusted him. I had merged my life with his completely. I had given him access to everything. And in return, he had cut me off like a dead limb. A bitter laugh bubbled up in my chest. It was not a sound of amusement. It was the sound of a memory surfacing. This was not the first time Jason had jeopardized our survival. The feeling of cold dread in my stomach was familiar. It transported me back to a Tuesday evening 3 years ago. I closed my eyes and the motel room faded away. I was back in our kitchen. The air was thick with tension. On the table between us lay a bank statement that I had pulled from the mailbox. It was bleeding red ink. "Where is the money, Jason?" I remembered the shaking in my voice. It was the same shaking I felt now. $10,000. The savings account is empty. Jason was leaning against the counter. He was eating an apple with infuriating calmness. He did not look guilty. He looked annoyed that I was interrupting his snack. "Relax, Sarah. It is an investment." "An investment!" I slammed the paper down on the table. "You took our emergency fund. That was for the house repairs. That was for if the car broke down. You took $10,000 without asking me. Where is it?" He took another bite of the apple and chewed slowly. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and condescension. It was a look designed to make me feel small. It was a look designed to make me question my own sanity. "You have such a waitress mindset, Sarah. That is your problem. You think about pennies. I am thinking about millions. I put it into a new tech opportunity. My friend from high school said it is guaranteed to triple in 3 months. I stared at him. I could not believe what I was hearing. "You gave $10,000 to a friend from high school. Are you insane? We can barely pay the mortgage." He pushed off the counter and walked toward me. He invaded my personal space. He used his height to loom over me. "Stop being so dramatic. You are suffocating me with your fear. This is why I am the visionary and you are the worker. You do not understand how wealth is built. You have to spend money to make money. I did this for us. I did this so you would not have to wipe tables for the rest of your life. You should be thanking me." Thanking him. He had stolen our safety net and gambled it away on a rumor, and somehow he had twisted it around so that I was the villain. I was the ungrateful wife who did not believe in him. That was his talent. He could take reality and bend it until it broke. The investment went to zero in 2 weeks. The friend disappeared. The money was gone forever. And what did I do? Did I leave him? Did I demand that he get a second job to pay it back? No. I remembered the weight of the trays at Miller's Diner. I remembered the way my feet throbbed after a 12-hour shift. I picked up extra hours. I worked weekends. I worked holidays. I smiled at customers who treated me like furniture. I poured endless cups of coffee. I scrubbed grease off the counters until my hands were raw. I worked myself into the ground to replace the $10,000 he had thrown away. And while I worked, Jason sat on the couch. He told me he was researching his next big opportunity. He told me he was networking. He told me he was too talented for manual labor. I opened my eyes. The beige walls of the motel room came back into focus. The realization hit me harder than the eviction. I had not just been a victim of his laziness. I had been an accomplice. I had enabled him. Every time I covered a bill, I was telling him it was okay to be useless. Every time I forgave a financial betrayal, I was teaching him that there were no consequences. I had cleaned up his messes for 15 years. I had paid his debts. I had soothed his ego. I had protected him from the reality of his own incompetence. And this was my reward. He had taken my sacrifice and used it as a stepping stone. He had waited until he thought he had a golden parachute, and then he had cut the strings. He called me worthless. I whispered the words to the empty room. But I made myself worthless to him. I gave and gave until I was empty, and he took and took until he was full. I looked at the $43 on the bedspread again. It was not just money. It was a scorecard. This was what I had to show for 15 years of loyalty. I picked up the bills and shoved them back into my wallet. A cold resolve began to harden in my chest. It replaced the panic. It was a new sensation. It was the feeling of a woman who had nothing left to lose. He thought he had won. He thought he was rich and powerful and free of his burden. But he had made a mistake. He had forgotten who actually balanced the checkbook. He had forgotten who actually kept the lights on. He had forgotten that the waitress mindset he despised was actually a survival instinct. I stood up. The mattress groaned. I walked to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I looked at my reflection in the cracked mirror. I looked tired. I looked worn. But for the first time in years, I looked awake. He wanted a war. He wanted to erase me. I dried my face with the rough white towel. He was about to find out that the worthless woman knew exactly what he was worth, and it was far less than $75 million. I sat on the edge of the sagging motel mattress. The plastic wrapper of a gas station sandwich crinkled in my hands. It was turkey on stale white bread. It cost $4.99. I took a bite. The bread was dry. It stuck to the roof of my mouth like paste. I forced myself to swallow. This was my dinner. This was my reality. But my mind was not in this dingy room with its peeling wallpaper and smell of mildew. My mind was drifting back 72 hours. I was back in the suffocating atmosphere of the funeral home. The memory was vivid. It played in my head like a high-definition movie that I could not pause. The viewing room had been filled with the scent of white lilies and heavy perfume. It was a cloying smell that tried to mask the scent of death, but only succeeded in making the air feel thick and unbreathable. I had stood near the casket. My grief was a heavy stone in my chest. Arthur had been more of a father to me than my own father ever was. I missed his gravelly voice. I missed his wisdom. I missed the way his eyes would crinkle when he told a joke. But I was the only one mourning. Jason stood 10 feet away near the entrance. He was wearing a black suit that was slightly too tight across the shoulders. He was surrounded by a cluster of relatives. These were aunts and cousins we had not seen in years. They were people who had never visited Arthur when he was sick. Now they were here to pay their respects and perhaps see if there was any money to be had. I watched Jason put a hand on Aunt Linda's shoulder. His face crumpled. He let out a shuddering sob that sounded heartbroken. It was so hard those last few nights, Linda. Jason's voice trembled with practiced emotion. I stayed up with him. I held his hand. I made sure he was comfortable. It was exhausting, but I could not leave his side. A son has to be there for his father. I stood there frozen. The blood drained from my face. The sheer audacity of his lie took my breath away. I remembered those last few nights vividly. I remembered the smell of bleach and sickness. I remembered the way Arthur's body had convulsed with coughing fits that left him gasping for air. I remembered begging Jason to help me turn Arthur over so I could change the soiled sheets. I am in the middle of a ranked match, Sarah. Do not bother me. That is what Jason had said from behind the closed door of his gaming room. He had turned up the volume on his headset so he would not have to hear his father dying in the next room. I was the one who had held Arthur's hand. I was the one who had wiped the sweat from his forehead. I was the one who had whispered reassurances as he slipped in and out of consciousness. I was the one who had administered the morphine drops with shaking hands. And now Jason was stealing my grief. He was stealing my sacrifice. He was wrapping himself in a cloak of stolen valor and presenting himself as the saintly son. "Oh, Jason, you are such a good man." Aunt Linda patted his arm soothingly. "Arthur was lucky to have you. Most sons would not have the strength to do what you did." I wanted to scream. I wanted to march over there and shout the truth into their faces. I wanted to tell them that Jason had called his father a burden. I wanted to tell them that Jason had complained about the smell. But I did nothing. I stood there in my modest black dress and bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. I remained the dutiful wife. I remained the silent supporter. I kept the peace for the sake of Arthur's memory, because I knew he would not have wanted a scene at his funeral. Now, sitting in this motel room with a half-eaten sandwich, I felt a surge of self-loathing. My silence had not been noble. It had been a capitulation. I had let him rewrite history without a fight. The memory shifted. The service ended, and we moved to the reception area. I sat alone at a small table. Jason had gravitated toward his brother Ryan. Ryan had flown in from California that morning. He was tanned and wore sunglasses indoors. He looked like a tourist who had accidentally wandered into a funeral. I watched them from across the room. They were not sharing memories of their father. They were huddled together in a corner. Their heads were bent close. They looked like conspirators planning a heist. I strained to hear them over the low murmur of the crowd. I heard the company was valued at $60 million last year. Ryan whispered the words. He took a sip from a flask he had snuck into the service, plus the house and the land, and the investment portfolio. Jason grinned. It was a greedy expression that looked grotesque on a grieving son. He looked like a child on Christmas morning who had just spotted the biggest box under the tree. "I am thinking of buying a boat first." Jason said the words loud enough for me to hear. "Maybe one of those big yachts I saw in Miami. I deserve a break after all this stress." I felt a wave of nausea. Arthur was not even in the ground yet. His body was still cold, and his sons were already spending his life's work on toys. They were vultures circling a carcass. They saw Arthur not as a man, but as a bank account that had finally matured. I looked away, unable to watch them any longer. That was when I noticed him. Mr. Sterling was standing near the refreshments table. He was Arthur's estate lawyer. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair and a posture that suggested military discipline. He was wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than my car. He was not looking at the buffet. He was looking at Jason. His expression was unreadable. It was not grief. It was not sympathy. It was a cold and clinical assessment. He looked like a scientist observing a specimen in a jar. There was a glint of disapproval in his eyes, but beneath it lay something else. It looked like anticipation. He noticed me watching him. His expression softened immediately. He walked toward my table. His movements were precise and deliberate. "Sarah, I am so sorry for your loss." His voice was deep and genuine. "Theodore spoke about you often. He was very fond of you." "Thank you, Mr. Sterling." I managed a weak smile. "He was a wonderful man. I am going to miss him terribly." Mr. Sterling nodded. He glanced over his shoulder at Jason, who was now laughing at something Ryan had said. The lawyer's jaw tightened slightly. "The will reading is scheduled for Thursday at 2 in the afternoon. Please make sure you are there." I paused. I was confused. "Me?" I asked. Jason said the lawyer told him it was just for family members. He said I did not need to come. For a brief moment, Mr. Sterling's professional mask slipped. A flash of anger crossed his features. It was sharp and dangerous. "That is unfortunate." Mr. Sterling said the words with an icy calm. "Because it concerns you very much indeed. Theodore specifically requested that you attend. In fact, he insisted on it." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. He placed it on the table in front of me. "Do not let anyone tell you otherwise, Sarah. Be there." He gave me one last significant look and then turned and walked away. He left me sitting there with a growing sense of unease. Back in the motel room, I swallowed the last bite of the dry sandwich. I looked at the clock on the nightstand. It was Tuesday evening. The reading was in 40 hours. Jason had lied to me about the reading. He had tried to exclude me. He had tried to erase me from the narrative just as he had tried to erase my caregiving. But Arthur had insisted. I felt a small spark of warmth in my chest. It was the first positive emotion I had felt in 3 days. Arthur had known. Even in death, he was trying to protect me. He had foreseen Jason's treachery. I crumpled the sandwich wrapper into a ball. I tossed it into the small trash can by the desk. I would be there. I would wear my best dress. I would hold my head high. I would not let Jason intimidate me. I would walk into that office and I would hear what Arthur had to say. For the first time since Jason threw my suitcase down the stairs, I felt a flicker of strength. It was faint, but it was there. I was not just a victim. I was a witness. And on Thursday, I would finally be heard. The ceiling fan in room 112 wobbled on its axis. It made a rhythmic clicking sound that sliced through the silence of the motel room like a metronome counting down the seconds of my insomnia. It was 3 a.m. The sheets were scratchy and smelled of industrial bleach, but my inability to sleep had nothing to do with the discomfort of the bed. It had everything to do with the ghosts that had followed me from the house. I closed my eyes and the dingy motel room dissolved. The smell of stale cigarettes was replaced by the sharp and medicinal scent of rubbing alcohol and the underlying earthy aroma of old age. I was back in the master bedroom of the house on Elm Street. I was back in the long and quiet nights of the last 6 months. People often speak about caregiving as a noble sacrifice or a beautiful act of love. They rarely talk about the intimate burden of it. They do not talk about the physical weight of a grown man who has lost the strength to lift his own hips. They do not talk about the indignity of changing adult diapers or the way the air in a sick room becomes thick and heavy as if the house itself is holding its breath. For 6 months I had lived in that rhythm. My life had shrunk to the 4 walls of Arthur's bedroom. While Jason slept in the guest room because he claimed the sound of the oxygen concentrator gave him anxiety, I was awake. I learned the language of Arthur's breathing. I knew the difference between the shallow rasp of sleep and the jagged gasp of pain. I remembered a Tuesday night just 3 weeks before he died. It was raining. The sound of water hammering against the roof was deafening. Arthur had woken up confused and in pain. His phantom limb syndrome was flaring up in his left leg, even though the leg was fine. It was his mind playing tricks on his deteriorating nervous system. I sat on the edge of his bed. I rubbed his calf with the peppermint lotion he liked. My hands were tired from a double shift at the diner, but I kept the rhythm steady. "Tell me about the bridge again, Arthur," I asked him quietly. I knew that getting him to talk about the past was the only way to distract him from the pain of the present. His eyes were cloudy, but they sparked with a sudden clarity. He took a rattling breath. "The Fort Wayne Suspension Bridge." His voice was a dry whisper that sounded like leaves scraping over concrete. 1982. Nobody thought we could finish it on schedule. The concrete suppliers were on strike. The city council was breathing down my neck. I continued to massage his leg. I watched the lines of pain on his forehead slowly smooth out. I was out there pouring cement at 3 a.m, Sarah. I did not just own the company, I built it. I knew the name of every man on that crew. I knew who had a new baby and who was going through a divorce. You build loyalty the same way you build a foundation. You mix it with sweat and you let it set over time. I listened to him with genuine reverence. This was the man who had built Harrison Construction from a single pickup truck and a loan into a $62 million empire. He was a titan of industry. Yet here he was, helpless in a flannel pajama set, relying on his daughter-in-law to help him sit up to drink water. The door to the bedroom creaked open. The spell was broken. Jason stood in the hallway. The light from his phone illuminated his face. He was wearing his noise-canceling headphones around his neck. He wrinkled his nose as the smell of the peppermint lotion and the faint odor of sickness hit him. "Can you guys keep it down?" Jason said. His voice was petulant. "I am trying to stream and the microphone is picking up his talking." I looked at my husband. I felt a flare of anger so hot it almost burned my throat. "Your father is in pain, Jason. He is telling me a story." Jason rolled his eyes. He leaned against the door frame, but he did not step into the room. He treated the threshold like a quarantine line. He tells the same stories every night. It is just the meds talking. And God, Sarah, it smells like a nursing home in here. Can we not just open a window? Or better yet, maybe it is time to look into that facility on the south side, the one with the nurses who are paid to deal with this stuff. Arthur turned his head slowly on the pillow. He looked at his son. He did not say a word. The disappointment in his eyes was not angry. It was resigned. It was the look of a man who realized that the empire he built had produced an heir who could not even endure the inconvenience of a smell. I stood up and walked to the door. I blocked Jason's view of his father. We are not putting him in a home. He built this house. He will stay in this house. Go back to your game, Jason. I will close the door so we do not disturb your important work. I shut the door in his face. I turned back to the bed. Arthur was looking at his hands. They were calloused and spotted with age. I am sorry, Arthur, I whispered. He reached out and patted my hand. His grip was weak, but his skin was warm. Do not apologize for him, Sarah. You cannot build a skyscraper on a swamp. Some foundations are just bad. Then there was the memory of the sunset. It was the week before he died. It was a rare, warm evening in early spring. I had managed to maneuver his wheelchair onto the back porch. We sat there watching the sky turn from blue to a bruised purple. Arthur had been quiet for a long time. He was staring at the oak tree in the backyard. You are a good woman, Sarah, he said it suddenly. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes on the horizon. You remind me of my wife. God rest her soul. She had the same kindness in her heart. She had the same steel in her spine, too. She never complained. She just did what needed to be done. I smiled and tucked the blanket tighter around his legs. You do not need to thank me, Arthur. You are family. He turned his head then. He looked at me with those sharp blue eyes that age had not dimmed. It was a look of intense scrutiny. It felt like he was looking through my skin and seeing the tired soul underneath. Family is not always about blood, my dear. He said the words with a slow and deliberate weight. Sometimes it is about who shows up when it matters. Blood is just biology. Loyalty is a choice. You chose to be here. Jason chose to be inside on his computer. I see that. Do not think I do not see that. At the time, I thought it was just the wisdom of a dying man reflecting on the nature of relationships. I did not know he was giving me a preview of his final judgment. I did not know he was telling me that he had already made a choice that would shatter our world. I opened my eyes in the motel room. The darkness felt less oppressive now. The memory of his voice was a comfort. He had seen me. In a house where my husband treated me like a servant and a nuisance, Arthur had seen me as a queen. I sat up in the bed. Sleep was impossible. The sun would be coming up in a few hours, and Thursday was approaching like a storm front. I needed to be ready. I needed to prepare myself for the reading of the will. I could not walk into Mr. Sterling's office looking like a victim. I stood up and walked over to my suitcase. It was lying open on the luggage rack. It was a chaotic mess of clothes I had thrown in blindly while Jason screamed at me. I needed to find something appropriate to wear, something that said I was still standing. I began to sort through the pile: jeans, t-shirts, my work uniform from the diner which smelled of grease, a wool sweater. My hand brushed against something rough and heavy. I pulled it out. It was a tweed jacket. My breath caught in my throat. It was Arthur's jacket. It was an old herringbone blazer with leather patches on the elbows. I must have grabbed it from the coat rack by the door in my panic. I remembered seeing it there and thinking I needed to take it to the dry cleaners because it had gathered dust since the funeral. In the chaos of being evicted, I had instinctively grabbed it along with my own coat. I held the jacket up. It still smelled like him. It smelled of the pipe tobacco he used to smoke years ago and the peppermint candies he kept in his pockets. It was a scent of safety. I buried my face in the rough fabric and let myself inhale the memory of the only man in that house who had ever respected me. As I hugged the jacket, I felt a hard lump in the inside breast pocket. I pulled back. I frowned. I reached inside the pocket. My fingers closed around a small rectangular object. I pulled it out. It was a black leather notebook. It was small, about the size of a postcard. The leather was worn and soft from years of handling. I recognized it immediately. Arthur always carried a notebook. He used them to write down measurements or ideas for construction projects. But this one was different. This one he had kept close to him in those final weeks. I had seen him writing in it when he thought I was not looking. I walked over to the small table by the window and turned on the lamp. The yellow light pooled on the desk. I sat down and placed the notebook in the center of the circle of light. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I felt like I was intruding. I felt like I was violating a sacred privacy, but I also felt a pull, a magnetic force urging me to open it. I opened the cover. The first few pages were blank. I flipped forward. The handwriting was shaky. It was the writing of a man whose hands trembled with weakness, but whose mind was still sharp. April 10th. The date was written at the top of the page. That was 6 weeks ago. Sarah made chicken soup today. She spent 3 hours making the broth from scratch because she knows the canned stuff upsets my stomach. She fed me 1 spoonful at a time. She did not rush. She talked to me about the birds at the feeder. I traced the words with my finger. Jason came in at 5. He asked Sarah why dinner was not ready for him yet. He did not ask how I was. He did not ask if she was tired. He just wanted his food. I raised a son who thinks the world owes him a meal. I have failed him as a father by giving him too much. I felt a tear slide down my cheek. He had noticed. He had noticed the soup. He had noticed the disrespect. I turned the page. April 15th. The writing was more jagged here. The pain was bad today. I could not get to the bathroom in time. It was humiliating. A man who built skyscrapers should not soil himself like an infant. I wanted to die of shame. Jason stood in the hallway and gagged. He told Sarah it was disgusting. I remembered that day. It was the day I had cleaned Arthur up while he cried silently. I had told him it was okay. I had told him it was just a body doing what bodies do. But Sarah... The pen had pressed hard into the paper here. Sarah did not flinch. She cleaned me with the tenderness of a mother caring for a child. She told me jokes to make me smile. She preserved my dignity when my own body tried to strip it away. She is the daughter I never had. She is the only one in this house who understands what it means to build something. She builds comfort. She builds love. Jason only knows how to consume. I turned the page again. May 1st. This was just 2 weeks before he died. I called Vincent Sterling today. We talked for 2 hours. I told him everything. I told him about the will. I know what I have to do. It will cause a storm. Jason will be furious. He will hate me. But I cannot leave my life's work to a man who will squander it on toys, and I cannot leave Sarah to the mercy of a husband who treats her like a servant. I have to protect her. She is the true heir to the Harrison legacy because she is the only one who has the Harrison heart. I stared at the words. The letters swam before my eyes. She is the true heir. The air in the motel room suddenly felt different. It was no longer stale and suffocating. It was electric. I was not crazy. I was not imagining things. I was not just a scorned wife making up stories to comfort herself. Arthur had seen everything. He had watched the dynamic of our marriage with the precision of a structural engineer looking for cracks in a foundation. He had judged Jason and found him wanting. He had judged me and found me worthy. I closed the notebook and pressed it against my chest. The tears that flowed now were not tears of despair. They were tears of release. They were the hot, cleansing tears of validation. For 15 years, I had been told I was lucky that Jason married me. I had been told I was plain, I was boring, I was just a waitress. Jason had chipped away at my self-worth until there was almost nothing left. But Arthur had seen the truth. I stood up. I walked to the mirror above the dresser. I looked at my reflection. My eyes were red and puffy. My hair was a mess, but there was something new in the set of my jaw. I was not going to the will reading as a victim. I was going as a witness. I was going as the keeper of Arthur's truth. I had the evidence in my hand. I had his voice in my pocket. Jason thought he could throw me away. He thought he could erase me. But he had forgotten one thing. He had forgotten that his father was a builder, and builders know that the most important part of the structure is not the flashy facade, it is the load-bearing wall. I was the load-bearing wall, and without me, the house of Jason Harrison was about to collapse. I placed the notebook carefully into my purse. I smoothed down the front of my shirt. I watched the sunrise begin to bleed gray light through the curtains. Bring on Thursday. I was ready. Thursday arrived with the kind of gray and dreary weather that seemed to match my mood perfectly. The sky was a flat sheet of slate that pressed down on the city of Fort Wayne. It threatened rain, but delivered only a damp and bone-chilling cold. Inside room 112, the air was still thick with the humidity of the shower I had just taken. The mirror was fogged around the edges. I wiped it clear with the palm of my hand. The face that stared back at me was pale. It was the face of a woman who had slept for less than 4 hours in the last 3 days. I turned away from the reflection and walked to the ironing board. It was a flimsy metal contraption that screeched every time I moved it. I was ironing my black dress. It was the same dress I had worn to the funeral 3 days ago. It was the only formal piece of clothing I had with me. It was a simple sheath dress I had bought at a discount store 5 years ago. I moved the iron with slow and deliberate strokes. The steam hissed and rose up to dampen my cheeks. I pressed out the wrinkles of grief. I pressed out the creases of despair. I focused entirely on the task. I needed the fabric to be perfect. I needed to look impeccable. I had spent $10 of my last $43 on a bottle of concealer and a tube of lipstick from the drugstore down the street. It was a foolish expense by any logical financial standard. I did not know where my next meal was coming from. I did not know where I would sleep tomorrow night once my credit at this terrible motel ran out. But as I looked at the makeup scattered on the cheap laminate counter, I knew it was necessary. There is a secret that women over 30 know. It is a secret we learn through heartbreak and rejection and the slow accumulation of invisible scars. We know that appearance is not vanity. It is armor. When your world is crumbling and your heart is bleeding, you do not go out into the world looking broken. If you look like a victim, the world will treat you like one. It will step on you. It will sweep you aside without a second thought. I sat down on the edge of the sagging bed and began to apply the makeup. My hands were steady now. I applied the concealer under my eyes. I dabbed away the dark purple shadows that 3 nights of crying had left behind. I watched the evidence of my pain disappear under the beige cream. I blended it carefully. I wanted to erase the sleepless nights. I wanted to erase the fear. I applied the lipstick. It was a shade called Crimson Victory. I chose it because the name sounded like a promise. It was a bold color. It was a color that said, I was not afraid to be seen. I was constructing a facade. I was building a fortress around the frightened woman inside. I looked at myself in the mirror again. I saw Sarah. But I did not see the waitress Jason despised. I did not see the woman he had called worthless. I saw the woman who had managed a household budget on a shoestring for 15 years. I saw the woman who had negotiated with creditors when Jason lost his job. I saw the woman who had managed the complex medical schedule of a dying man while working double shifts. I saw a manager. I saw a caregiver. I saw a survivor. You are not weak, Sarah. I spoke to the reflection. My voice was low and steady in the quiet room. You ran that house. You kept the roof over his head. You put the food on his table. He thinks he carried you, but you were the foundation he stood on. Do not let him see you shake. Do not let him see you bleed. You are walking into that room to represent Arthur. You have to be the woman he believed you were. I stood up and put on the black dress. It fit perfectly. I zipped it up the back and smoothed the fabric over my hips. I brushed my hair back into a severe bun at the nape of my neck. It pulled my features tight. It gave me a look of severity that I liked. It made me look serious. It made me look like someone who was not there to play games. I slipped my feet into my black heels. They were scuffed at the toes, but I had polished them with a black marker to hide the wear. If I walked fast enough, nobody would notice. I picked up my purse. I felt the weight of the black leather notebook inside. It was heavy against my hip. It was my talisman. It was my weapon. It was the proof that I was not crazy. It was the proof that I was loved. I took a deep breath and walked out of the motel room. I left the key card on the table. I left the frightened girl behind in the unmade bed. The woman who walked to the car was a soldier going to battle. The drive downtown was a blur of gray streets and red traffic lights. My mind was focused on the destination. The law office of Vincent Sterling was located in a restored Victorian mansion in the historic district of downtown Fort Wayne. It was a building that radiated old money and quiet power. The brick was polished and red. The ivy climbing the walls was manicured to perfection. The brass plaque by the door shone with an intimidating luster. It was the kind of place that made you check your shoes for mud before you stepped onto the porch. It was a place where serious decisions were made by serious people. I parked my battered sedan 2 blocks away. I squeezed it into a spot between a delivery truck and a fire hydrant. I did not want Jason to see it. I did not want him to see the symbol of my poverty parked next to the shiny new life he thought he had won. I walked the 2 blocks with my head held high. The wind bit at my bare legs, but I did not shiver. I did not let myself hunch against the cold. I walked with the rhythm of a woman who belonged there. I pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped into the waiting room. The transition was immediate. The noise of the city vanished. The air inside smelled of leather and old paper and expensive coffee. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers. It was a sanctuary of order and law. The floors were polished hardwood that gleamed under the soft lighting of crystal chandeliers. Walls were lined with shelves of leather-bound legal books that looked like they held the secrets of the universe. And sitting in the middle of this sanctuary were the architects of my misery. Jason and his brother Ryan were sitting on a leather sofa near the window. They looked like they owned the building. They looked like they owned the whole city. Jason was wearing a new suit. It was a navy blue designer cut that screamed money. I recognized the fabric from the magazines I used to read at the dentist. It was Italian wool. He must have bought it yesterday. He must have used the joint account that he had locked me out of. He was wearing my hard work on his back. He had styled his hair with expensive product. He looked handsome in a superficial way. He looked like a successful man. But I knew the truth. I knew he was a hollow shell painted with gold paint. Ryan was laughing at something Jason said. He slapped his knee. They were vibrating with excitement. They were 2 boys waiting to be handed the keys to the candy store. Ryan was dressed in a casual blazer and jeans that cost more than my entire wardrobe. He had the relaxed posture of someone who had never had to worry about a bill in his life. I stood in the doorway for a moment. I watched them. I saw the arrogance in Jason's posture. He was leaning back with his legs crossed at the ankle. He was checking his watch every few seconds. It was a gesture of impatience that said his time was now worth more than anyone else's. "Sorry I'm late," Jason announced to the empty room as if he were addressing an audience. He did not see me yet. I was on the phone with a yacht broker in Florida. Got to start planning how to spend all this money right. He laughed. It was that same cruel laugh that had echoed in our hallway 3 days ago. It was a laugh that lacked any warmth. I stepped further into the room. My heels clicked on the hardwood floor. The sound was sharp and distinct. It cut through their laughter. Jason turned his head. His smile vanished instantly. It was replaced by a look of pure annoyance. It was the look one gives to a fly that has buzzed into the room. It was a look of disgust. "What is she doing here?" Jason asked. He did not address me. He addressed the air. He addressed Ryan. He spoke as if I were an object that had been delivered to the wrong address. "This is family business." Ryan looked at me with a smirk. He looked me up and down, assessing my dress and my scuffed shoes. His eyes were cold and calculating. "Maybe she is here to apply for a cleaning job," Ryan said. He chuckled at his own wit. He nudged Jason with his elbow. I felt a flare of heat in my chest. It was a hot ball of rage, but I did not let it reach my face. I kept my expression smooth and cold. I walked past them. I did not flinch. I did not cower. I walked to the chair opposite them and sat down. I crossed my legs. I placed my purse on my lap. "I am here because I was invited, Jason." I said the words calmly. My voice did not shake. It was steady and clear. Jason stood up. He loomed over me. He tried to use his height to intimidate me, just like he had in our kitchen. He took 2 steps toward me. His face was flushed with anger. "Nobody invited you. You are not family anymore. I kicked you out. Remember, you are nothing. You are just a waitress looking for a handout. You think because you changed Dad's diapers a few times you deserve a cut. Well, you are wrong. The will is for his sons. It is for his blood." I stopped looking at his tie and looked him directly in the face. I was close enough to smell his cologne. It was a new scent. It was expensive and overpowering. It smelled like arrogance. I gripped my purse tighter. I could feel the outline of the notebook through the leather. I felt the hard edges of the book pressing against my palm. It grounded me. I felt the ghost of Arthur standing beside me. I remembered his handwriting. "She is the true heir." I did not beg. I did not ask him to be reasonable. I did not ask him to remember our 15 years of marriage. Those days were gone. The man I had married was dead. This man standing before me was a stranger. I let him see the steel that Arthur had told me I possessed. I let him see the cold, hard wall of my dignity. My eyes did not plead. They judged. "I am not looking for a handout, Jason," I said softly. My voice was dangerous in its quietness. "I am looking for justice." Jason blinked. He seemed taken aback by my tone. He stepped back slightly. He was used to the Sarah who apologized. He was used to the Sarah who tried to keep the peace. He was used to the Sarah who cried. He did not know this woman. This woman frightened him, although he did not know why yet. Before he could respond, the heavy double doors to the inner office opened. Vincent Sterling emerged. He looked impeccable and grave. He wore a 3-piece charcoal suit. His silver hair was perfectly combed. He looked from Jason to me and back again. He assessed the tension in the room instantly. "Jason, Calvin, Sarah." He nodded to each of us. His voice was professional, but there was a warmth when he said my name that was absent when he addressed the brothers. "Thank you all for coming. Please follow me into the conference room." Jason shot me one last glare. It was a look of pure venom. "You are wasting your time." He hissed the words at me. He turned and strutted into the conference room with Ryan trailing behind him like a puppy. He walked with the swagger of a man who believes he has already won the game. I took a breath. I touched the notebook one last time through the leather of my purse. Then I stood up. I smoothed my dress. I walked toward the open doors. I was walking into the fire, but I was not afraid of getting burned. I was the one bringing the matches. The conference room was a cavernous space dominated by a table that seemed long enough to land a small aircraft. It was a slab of polished mahogany that gleamed under the soft light of the crystal chandelier. The wood was dark and rich. It smelled of lemon oil and serious money. The walls were lined with portraits of unsmiling men in stiff collars who looked down on us with judgment in their painted eyes. This was a room designed to intimidate. It was a room designed to remind you that the law was a heavy and unyielding thing. Mr. Sterling took his place at the head of the table. He moved with the slow and deliberate grace of a man who knew he held all the cards. He placed a thick manila folder on the wood in front of him. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the table echoed in the silence. Jason and Ryan sat on the left side of the table. They sprawled in the high-backed leather chairs with a casual arrogance that made my teeth ache. Jason had unbuttoned his suit jacket to accommodate his confident posture. He drummed his fingers on the table. He looked like a king waiting for his coronation. Ryan sat next to him and checked his phone under the table. They were a united front. They were the sons. They were the bloodline. They were the winners. I sat alone on the right side. The distance between us felt symbolic. It was a gulf of 15 years of silence and sacrifice. Across that expanse of mahogany, I looked at the man I had married. He did not look back. He was too busy whispering something to his brother about a listing for a penthouse downtown. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. The sound was sharp and commanding. It cut through the whispers instantly. "Before we begin," Mr. Sterling said. His voice was deep and devoid of warmth. "I want to make sure everyone understands the protocol. This reading will proceed exactly as Arthur specified in his instructions. There will be no interruptions. There will be no questions until I am finished, and there will be no disputes until the document has been read in its entirety. Is that understood? Jason leaned forward. He rested his elbows on the table. He flashed a charming smile that did not reach his eyes. Whatever you say, Mr. Sterling. I am just ready to hear the good news. Let us get the formalities over with so we can celebrate. Something in Mr. Sterling's expression shifted. It was almost imperceptible. A tiny tightening of the muscles around his mouth, a slight narrowing of his steel-gray eyes. Jason. Mr. Sterling said the name with a heavy pause. Before we proceed, I have to ask a question. Did you bother reading the copy of the will that was sent to your house last week via certified mail? Jason waved his hand dismissively. It was a gesture of supreme unconcern. I skimmed it. You know how it is. All that legal language is confusing. Wherefore and heretofore and all that nonsense. It gave me a headache. I figured you would explain the important parts today. Besides, I know Dad left everything to me. I am his eldest son. It is pretty straightforward. Mr. Sterling's eyebrows rose slightly. It was a look of profound disappointment. I see. And you, Ryan? Ryan shrugged. He did not even look up from his phone. Same here. Jason said it was all just formalities anyway. I trust my brother. Mr. Sterling looked at them for a long moment. He seemed to be cataloging their arrogance. He seemed to be storing it away for future reference. Then he turned his head slowly and looked directly at me. Sarah, did you receive a copy? I shook my head. I felt a flush of embarrassment, but I held his gaze. No, Mr. Sterling. I did not. Mr. Sterling frowned. That is strange. The courier confirmed delivery to the residence on Tuesday. I looked across the table at Jason. He was avoiding my eyes now. He was suddenly very interested in a scratch on the mahogany table. Jason signed for the mail that day, I said quietly. He told me it was just legal paperwork for the estate. He told me I did not need to see it because it did not concern me. The silence that followed was heavy. It was electric. Mr. Sterling's professional composure cracked for a fraction of a second. I saw a flash of genuine anger in his eyes. It was a white-hot flare of indignation. That is unfortunate, Mr. Sterling said. His voice dropped an octave. It was icy, because it concerns you very much indeed. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The air grew thin. The casual confidence that had surrounded Jason and Ryan began to evaporate. Jason stopped drumming his fingers. He shifted in his chair. He looked at Mr. Sterling with a flicker of confusion. What is that supposed to mean? Jason asked. His voice was no longer smooth. It had a jagged edge of uncertainty. Mr. Sterling ignored him. He opened the thick folder. He withdrew a document bound in blue paper with official red seals and ribbons. He smoothed it out on the table with reverent hands. The last will and testament of Arthur James Harrison, Mr. Sterling announced formally, dated March 15th of this year. March 15th. My mind raced back to that date. That was just 2 months ago. That was well after Arthur's second stroke. That was around the time Jason had made the comment about the nursing home. That was the week I had stayed up 3 nights in a row because Arthur was afraid to sleep alone. I looked at Jason. He was frowning. He was doing the math in his head too. Wait, Jason said. March 15th. Dad was practically gone by then. He was on all those meds. Mr. Sterling raised a hand. It was a command for silence. I will remind you of the rules, Jason. No interruptions. Jason shut his mouth, but his eyes were darting around the room. He looked like an animal that sensed a trap closing, but could not yet see the cage. Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses. He began to read. I, Arthur James Harrison, being of sound mind and body, do hereby set forth my last will and testament. I revoke all prior wills and codicils. I declare that I am a widower and that I have 2 sons, Jason and Ryan. Mr. Sterling paused. He looked up over his glasses at the 2 men. Then he continued, to my son, Jason Harrison. Jason sat up straighter. He licked his lips. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment the $75 million would drop into his lap. Who has shown little appreciation for hard work or family loyalty? And who views his inheritance as a right rather than a responsibility? Jason froze. The smile slid off his face like oil. I leave the sum of $5,000 and my grandfather's fishing equipment, which is currently stored in the garage. The words hit the room like a physical blow. $5,000. The number hung in the air. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was the price of a used car. It was the price of the suit Jason was wearing. Jason blinked. He looked at Mr. Sterling. He looked at Ryan. He looked at me. Then he laughed. It was a nervous and stuttering sound. "Okay, good one," Jason said. His voice was high and tight. Dad always had a weird sense of humor. "Okay, so I get the fishing rods. Funny. Now get to the real part." Mr. Sterling did not smile. He did not blink. He held up his hand for silence and continued reading. "To my son, Ryan Harrison." Ryan looked up from his phone. He looked confused. "Who moved to California 5 years ago and visits perhaps twice a year when he needs money. I leave the sum of $10,000 and my collection of vintage woodworking tools, with the hope that he might finally learn the value of building something with his own hands instead of asking others to pay for his lifestyle." Ryan's mouth fell open. The phone slipped from his hand and clattered onto the table. $10,000, Ryan whispered. He looked stricken. "That will not even cover my credit card bill for this trip." Jason was beginning to panic now. The reality was sinking in. This was not a joke. This was a legal document. He stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "This is impossible," Jason shouted. His face turned a blotchy red. "I am his son. I am his heir. Where is the rest of it? Where is the $75 million? Where is the company? Where is the house? You cannot leave me $5,000. That is an insult." Mr. Sterling remained seated. He remained calm, but his eyes were hard as flint. "If you had read the will as instructed, Jason, you would know that there is much more to be read. Sit down." Jason remained standing. He was breathing heavily. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "Read it then." Jason snarled. "Read the part where he leaves the real assets to the family trust or whatever. I know how these things work. He probably put it in a trust to avoid taxes." Mr. Sterling waited until Jason sank back into his chair. The leather groaned under his weight. "The bulk of the estate." Mr. Sterling continued. His voice was steady and relentless. "Harrison Construction Company valued at approximately $62 million. The family home and surrounding property on Elm Street valued at $8 million, plus all liquid assets, stocks, investments, and personal property totaling approximately $5 million. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs. The numbers were staggering. I had known Arthur was wealthy, but hearing the total sum was overwhelming. $75 million. It was enough money to change a life. It was enough money to ruin a life. Jason was leaning forward. He was practically vibrating with greed. He was ready to forgive the insult of the $5,000 as long as the trust fund was substantial. "Goes to someone else entirely," Mr. Sterling said. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum. Jason looked like he had been slapped. "What?" he whispered. "Who else is there? We are his only family." Mr. Sterling looked at me. His expression softened. It was a look of profound respect. "To Sarah Marie Harrison." Mr. Sterling read the name clearly. He enunciated every syllable. My world tilted on its axis. The room spun. The portraits on the walls seemed to lean in. Sarah. Me. The woman with $43 in her purse. The woman staying in a motel room that smelled of mildew. The woman who had been thrown out like garbage. Who has shown more love, loyalty, and dedication to me in 15 years than my own blood relatives have shown in a lifetime. Mr. Sterling continued reading. "I leave the entirety of my remaining estate." I could not breathe. I could not process the words. I felt a roaring in my ears. Jason made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. He turned his head slowly to look at me. His eyes were wide and terrified. He looked at me as if he had never seen me before. "No," he whispered. "No, that is a lie." He looked at Mr. Sterling. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "She is not even blood. She is just my wife. She is just—" He could not finish the sentence. The word worthless died in his throat. I watched him, and in that moment I did not feel triumph. I did not feel the rush of victory I had expected. I felt pity. I looked at this man who was 40 years old. He was wearing a $3,000 suit. He was sitting in a room that smelled of power, but he looked like a toddler who had been told he could not have a cookie. I watched his face crumble. I watched the entitlement drain out of him, leaving only fear. He was pathetic. He was small. He had spent his entire life waiting for his father to die so he could be rich. He had never built anything. He had never earned anything. He defined his worth by what he could take. And now that there was nothing to take, he was nothing. The mask of the confident heir had fallen away. Beneath it was just a greedy child who had forgotten to say thank you. I sat up straighter in my chair. I felt the weight of the notebook in my purse. I felt the presence of Arthur in the room. He had done this. He had set this stage. He had forced Jason to reveal his true nature, and then he had pulled the rug out from under him. It was cruel, but it was just. Jason turned to Ryan. He was looking for an ally. But Ryan was staring at the table, his face pale and shocky. Ryan knew the game was over. Ryan knew there was no fighting this, but Jason could not accept it. You manipulated him. Jason shouted at me. His voice was shrill. You did something to him. You poisoned his mind. You spent all that time alone with him in the bedroom. What did you tell him? What lies did you feed him? Mr. Sterling slammed his hand down on the table. The sound was like a gunshot. That is enough, Jason. Mr. Sterling's voice was thunderous. Your father was of sound mind. He underwent a complete psychological evaluation before signing this document. I have the report right here. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew exactly who you were. Jason slumped back in his chair. He looked like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He covered his face with his hands. This cannot be happening, he sobbed. I already ordered the boat. I watched him cry over a boat he could not buy while I sat there thinking about the sandwich I had eaten for dinner. The contrast was stark. It was grotesque. He was not crying for his father. He was not crying for the loss of a parent. He was crying for his lost toys. And in that moment, I knew that Arthur was right. Jason did not deserve the legacy. He would have destroyed it. He would have consumed it. I looked at Mr. Sterling. He gave me a small nod. It was a nod of solidarity. There is more, Mr. Sterling said quietly. Theodore wrote a personal letter to accompany this bequest. He asked that I read it aloud. Jason lowered his hands. His face was streaked with tears. He looked defeated. But I knew the fight was not over. I knew that greed did not die easily. But I was ready. I had my armor on, and for the first time in my life, I held the power. Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses and looked down at the document with the gravity of a judge delivering a death sentence. The room was silent enough to hear the hum of the air conditioning system. Jason was staring at the lawyer with a mixture of impatience and growing unease. He still believed there was a mistake. He still believed that the punchline was coming and that he would walk out of this room the king of Fort Wayne. The bulk of the estate consists of 100% of the shares of Harrison Construction Company. Mr. Sterling read the words with slow deliberation. Independent valuation conducted last fiscal quarter places the worth of the company at approximately $62 million. Jason licked his lips. His eyes darted to Ryan. I could see the greed vibrating off him like heat waves off asphalt. $62 million. It was a number that defied comprehension for people like us. It was not just money. It was power. It was freedom. It was the ability to never work another day in your life, in addition to the company. Mr. Sterling continued. The estate includes the primary residence on Elm Street and the 40 acres of surrounding woodland. Current market valuation is $8 million. Furthermore, the estate includes all liquid assets currently held in the Harrison Family Trust, including stocks, bonds, and cash reserves totaling approximately $5 million. I did the math in my head. $75 million. It was the same number Jason had screamed at me 3 days ago. It was the number he had used to bludgeon me into submission. It was the number that justified throwing his wife out on the street. Mr. Sterling looked up from the paper. He took off his glasses and folded them on the table. He looked directly at Jason. All of these assets, the company, the house, the land, and the cash, are hereby bequeathed to the sole beneficiary named in this will. Jason leaned forward. He was practically salivating. He extended his hand as if he expected Mr. Sterling to hand him a check right then and there. Finally, Jason breathed. "Just give me the papers, Vincent. I am ready to sign." Mr. Sterling did not move. He did not hand over the papers. He kept his eyes locked on Jason. "The sole beneficiary is not you, Jason." The air left the room. It happened in an instant. The oxygen seemed to vanish, leaving a vacuum that pulled at my eardrums. Jason froze. His hand was still extended in midair. His smile faltered. It did not disappear immediately. It just hung there like a mask that had slipped sideways. "What?" he whispered. "What did you say?" Mr. Sterling turned his head slowly. He looked across the table at me. His expression was solemn. It was respectful. "The sole beneficiary is Sarah Marie Harrison." He spoke my name into the silence. Sarah Marie Harrison. The syllables seemed to hang in the air. They bounced off the mahogany walls. They echoed in the high ceiling. For a reason I cannot explain, the room seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of the table. My knuckles turned white. I felt a roaring in my ears that sounded like a freight train. Me. It was impossible. It was a mistake. It had to be a clerical error. I was the waitress. I was the tedious wife. I was the burden. I was the one who clipped coupons and worried about the electric bill. I was not the owner of a $62 million company. I looked at Jason. His face had gone completely slack. His mouth hung open. He looked like he had suffered a stroke. He stared at me, but he was not seeing me. He was seeing a ghost. He was seeing his future evaporate. "Why?" Jason choked out the word. It was barely a sound. Mr. Sterling looked back at the document. He read the final clause of the will. "To Sarah Marie Harrison, who has shown more love, loyalty, and dedication to me in 15 years than my own blood relatives have shown in a lifetime. She is the only person in this family who understands that wealth is a responsibility and not a playground. She is the builder. You are merely the tenants." The silence that followed was deafening. Ryan picked up his phone from the table. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped it again. The clatter was loud and startling. "This is a joke, right?" Ryan asked. His voice was high and thin. "This is some kind of sick lesson Dad wanted to teach us from the grave." "Right, Vincent. You are going to tell us the real will now." Mr. Sterling shook his head. "There is no other will, Ryan. This is it. This is the final legal word of your father." Jason made a sound low in his throat. It was a growl of pure animal rage. He stood up slowly. He braced his hands on the table. He leaned toward me. His face was twisted into a mask of hatred that was so pure it was terrifying. "You did this," he hissed. "You witch! You stole my life." My heart was hammering against my ribs. It was beating so hard I thought it would bruise the bone. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. I was not afraid of him anymore, but the shock was physical. It was a wave of vertigo that threatened to pull me under. Mr. Sterling reached into the folder again. "Sit down, Jason," Mr. Sterling commanded. His voice was like a whip crack. "I am not finished. Theodore wrote a personal letter to accompany this bequest. He asked that I read it aloud to all of you." Jason did not sit. He stood there breathing heavily. He looked like he was about to leap across the table and strangle me. But something in Mr. Sterling's tone stopped him. It was the promise of an explanation. It was the desperate hope that maybe the letter would reveal a loophole. Maybe the letter would say it was all a test and he had passed by getting angry. He sank back into his chair. He glared at me. "Read it." Jason spat the words. "Read whatever lies she forced him to write." Mr. Sterling unfolded a sheet of cream-colored stationery. I recognized the paper immediately. It was from the personalized set Arthur kept in his study. I recognized the handwriting. It was jagged and shaky. It was the writing of a dying man who was fighting to control his own hand. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat and began to read. "My dear Sarah." The use of my first name made tears prick my eyes instantly. It was the voice of my friend. It was the voice of the only father I had ever truly known. If you are hearing this, then I have passed on. And you are learning for the first time that I have chosen to leave my life work to you rather than to my sons. I know this will come as a shock to you. You are a humble woman, Sarah. You have never asked for anything. In 15 years of marriage to my son, you never once asked me for money. You never asked for favors. You simply did the work. I felt a tear slide down my cheek. It was true. I had been too proud to ask. Even when Jason drained our accounts, I had never gone to Arthur. I thought I was protecting Jason's reputation. I did not know Arthur was watching the whole time. This decision was not made lightly, nor was it made in anger. It was made with careful observation and deep consideration of who truly embodies the values that built Harrison Construction Company. Mr. Sterling paused to let the words sink in. He looked at Jason. I watched you work double shifts at the diner to support my son while he chose leisure over labor. I watched you pay his debts when his foolish investments failed. Jason flinched. He looked away. He knew exactly which debts his father was talking about. I watched you care for me in my illness, with genuine compassion while Jason complained about the inconvenience. I watched you treat our home with respect, while Jason saw it only as a commodity to be sold for profit. I closed my eyes. I could hear Arthur's voice in my head. I could smell the peppermint lotion. I could feel the rough wool of his jacket. Most importantly, Mr. Sterling continued, I watched you demonstrate every day the qualities of character that I spent my lifetime trying to instill in my sons, but failed to see take root. Kindness, integrity, dedication, and humility. The tears were flowing freely now. I did not wipe them away. I let them fall. I was crying because for 15 years I had felt invisible. I had felt like a ghost in my own life. I had worked and sacrificed and loved without expectation of return, and I had believed that nobody noticed. I had believed that my efforts were vanishing into the void. But Arthur had seen. He had seen the soup. He had seen the late nights. He had seen the way I held my head high when Jason belittled me. He had seen the strength it took to stay silent. You are not worthless, Sarah. Mr. Sterling read the sentence with emphasis. You are the finest investment I ever made. You are the daughter of my heart, and you are the only person I trust to protect the future of this family. I felt a sob break loose from my chest. It was a sound of release. It was the sound of a heavy chain falling from my neck. The money did not matter in that moment. The $62 million was an abstraction, but the words were real. The validation was solid gold. I had been seen. I had been valued. I had been chosen. Jason was not crying. He was turning a shade of purple that was alarming. He was shaking his head. This is insane, Jason interrupted. He slammed his hand on the table. He was senile. He did not know what he was writing. She brainwashed him. She was the only one with access to him. She probably wrote that letter herself and forced him to sign it. Mr. Sterling raised his hand. I am not finished, Jason. There is a second part to the letter, and I suggest you listen very carefully because your father wrote this part specifically for you. The atmosphere in the room shifted again. It went from emotional to dangerous. The air grew cold. Mr. Sterling turned the page. His voice became harder. It lost the warmth it had held when he addressed me. It became the voice of judgment. Sarah, you may wonder why I never spoke to you about this decision while I was alive, Mr. Sterling read. The truth is, I wanted to observe. I wanted to see how Jason would treat you when he believed his inheritance was certain. I wanted to see if the prospect of wealth would make him a better man, or if it would strip away his mask completely. I gasped. The realization hit me like a physical blow. It was a test. The silence had been a trap. Arthur had known. He had known Jason's character better than I did. His behavior these past months has been disappointing, but I fear his behavior following my death will be unforgivable. Mr. Sterling looked up at Jason. "If you are hearing this, Jason, it means that my predictions were correct. It means that you have likely already mistreated Sarah. It means you have likely tried to exclude her from this inheritance. It means you have likely revealed your true nature." Jason stood up again. This time, he knocked his chair backward. It crashed to the floor with a loud bang. "This is a setup!" Jason screamed. His voice cracked. "You two planned this, you and the old man. You set me up to fail. You cannot do this to me. I am his son. I have rights. I will contest this. I will drag you through court until there is nothing left. I will prove he was crazy." He pointed a trembling finger at me. "And you. You think you won. You think you are smart. You are nothing. You are a thief. I will ruin you. I will make sure you never see a dime of this money." Mr. Sterling did not flinch. He did not blink. He waited for Jason to stop screaming. He waited for the echoes of his threat to die down. Then he delivered the final blow. "Sit down, Jason, or I will have security escort you from the premises." Mr. Sterling spoke with a deadly calm. "Your father anticipated this response. He knew you would threaten legal action. He knew you would try to destroy Sarah rather than accept your own failure." Mr. Sterling reached into the folder one last time. He pulled out a thick document stapled together. "Theodore underwent a complete psychological evaluation just 2 weeks before signing this will." Mr. Sterling held up the document. "Dr. Elizabeth Morrison conducted the evaluation. She is the leading forensic psychiatrist in the state. She videotaped the sessions. She documented his mental state extensively. Her report concludes that Theodore James Harrison was completely competent, clear-minded, and acting entirely of his own free will." Mr. Sterling dropped the report on the table. It landed with a heavy thud. "This will is ironclad, Jason. It is bulletproof. You can hire every lawyer in Indiana. You can spend your last $5,000 on legal fees. But you will lose, and you will lose publicly. The court record will show exactly why your father disinherited you. It will show the world exactly what kind of man you are." Jason stared at the report. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. He looked at Mr. Sterling. He looked at me. The fight drained out of him. The rage evaporated, leaving only a hollow panic. He realized he was trapped. He realized that his father had outsmarted him from the grave. Arthur had not just cut him out. He had built a fortress around the money that Jason could not breach. Jason collapsed back into his chair. He did not bother to pick it up. He just slumped against the edge of the table. He put his head in his hands. He began to sob. It was not a dignified sound. It was the ugly, wet sound of a man who realizes he has destroyed his own life. He had thrown me out. He had burned his bridge. He had revealed his cruelty to the world, and he had done it all for a fortune that was never his. I watched him weep. And for the first time in 3 days, I did not feel the urge to comfort him. I sat still. I sat tall. I let the silence of the room envelop me. I was the builder now, and the first thing I was going to build was a wall between me and the man who had tried to break me. The sound of Jason sobbing into his hands was the only thing that filled the large conference room. It was a pathetic and jagged sound. It was the sound of a man watching his entire identity dissolve into mist. For 40 years, Jason had defined himself by what he was going to inherit. He had built his ego on a foundation of future millions. He had treated people like disposable objects because he believed he was destined for a throne. Now the throne was gone. The kingdom had been given to the servant, and the prince was just a middle-aged man with no job and $5,000 to his name. Mr. Sterling allowed the weeping to continue for exactly 1 minute. He checked his watch. He was a man who valued efficiency, and he had clearly decided that enough time had been wasted on theatrics. "The reading of the will is concluded," Mr. Sterling announced. His voice was devoid of sympathy. It was the tone of a surgeon declaring a time of death. "The terms are clear and legally binding. The assets will be transferred to Sarah Harrison according to the schedule laid out in the trust documents." Jason lowered his hands from his face. His eyes were red and swollen. His expensive suit was rumpled. He looked at Mr. Sterling with a dazed expression, as if he could not quite understand the language being spoken. "Transferred." Jason repeated the word. He sounded drunk. "Transferred to her. "Yes," Mr. Sterling replied. He began to gather the papers into a neat stack. "I need to speak with my client privately to discuss the details of the estate management. Jason and Ryan, you are free to go. Someone from my office will contact you next week about collecting your specific bequests. The fishing equipment and the tools can be picked up from the garage on Saturday." The dismissal was absolute. It was humiliating. They were being sent away like naughty schoolchildren. Ryan stood up immediately. He grabbed his phone from the table. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and awe. He realized that the power dynamic had shifted permanently. He wanted to get out of the room before the lightning struck again. "Come on, Jason," Ryan whispered. He tugged on his brother's sleeve. "Let us go. There is nothing we can do here." But Jason did not move. He was staring at me. The shock in his eyes was beginning to fade, and something else was taking its place. I watched the gears turn in his head. I watched him do the calculus of survival. He looked at the mahogany table. He looked at the crystal chandelier. He looked at the thick file of assets that Mr. Sterling was holding. Then he looked at me. He realized that I was the gatekeeper. I was the one holding the keys to the life he wanted. The transformation was instant and terrifying to watch. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He sat up straighter. He forced his mouth into a shape that resembled a smile. It was a gruesome imitation of affection. It was the smile of a shark that had decided not to bite but to bargain. "Sarah!" He said my name. His voice trembled, but he tried to inject it with warmth. "Honey, please." He stood up and walked around the table. Mr. Sterling tensed and looked ready to intervene, but I held up a hand. I wanted to see this. I wanted to see how low he would go. Jason stopped a few feet away from my chair. He reached out as if to touch my shoulder, but then pulled back when he saw the look in my eyes. He clasped his hands together in a pleading gesture. "You have to understand," Jason said. The words tumbled out of him in a rush. I did not mean what I said earlier. I was just upset. I was grieving. Losing Dad was so hard on me. You know how close we were. The stress made me crazy. I was not myself. I stared at him. I did not blink. The lie was so large it sucked the air out of the room. He had not been grieving. He had been shopping for yachts. "We can work this out," Jason continued. He took a step closer. He lowered his voice to an intimate whisper. "We are still married, Sarah. We are a team. Remember, for better or for worse. We have 15 years of history. You cannot just throw that away because of one bad argument. One bad argument. He was calling the systematic destruction of my self-esteem and the eviction from my home one bad argument. I love you, Sarah." He said the words, "I love you." He said it again as if repetition would make it true. I know I have been distant lately. I know I have been stressed. But now that we have this inheritance, we can finally be happy. We can travel. We can buy that house in Florida we talked about. We can start over. Just you and me. I looked at this man. I looked at his desperate eyes. I looked at his sweating forehead, and I felt a sensation rising in my chest that was colder than hate. It was disgust. It was a physical nausea. It churned in my stomach. I looked at him, and I saw a parasite. I saw a leech that had realized its host was about to detach it. He did not love me. He had never loved me. He loved the safety I provided. He loved the way I cleaned up his messes. And now he loved the $62 million attached to my name. I looked at his eyes, and I saw his reflection. He was not looking at his wife. He was looking at a walking wallet. He was looking at his ATM. He was willing to humiliate himself. He was willing to beg. He was willing to pretend to love the woman he had called garbage 5 minutes ago, just to keep his access to the money. It was repulsive. It was the most degrading thing I had ever witnessed. I remembered the way he had thrown my suitcase down the stairs. I remembered the way he had laughed when I asked him if our marriage meant anything. "It means I wasted 15 years. That is what he had said. Now he was standing there with his hands clasped like a choir boy, telling me we were a team. The silence stretched out. Jason's smile began to waver. He searched my face for a sign of softening. He searched for the Sarah who always forgave. He searched for the Sarah who was desperate for his approval, but that Sarah was not in the room, that Sarah had been left on the sidewalk 3 days ago. I stood up. The movement was slow and deliberate. I smoothed the front of my black dress. I picked up my purse. I looked Jason Harrison in the eye. I was 5 feet 4 inches tall, but in that moment, I felt like a giant. Jason. I said his name. My voice was soft. It was the voice of a librarian shushing a noisy patron. It was calm. It was terrifyingly even. You made it very clear 3 days ago that you do not need me anymore. Jason opened his mouth to interrupt, but I silenced him with a look. It was a look of such intense coldness that he snapped his mouth shut. You called me worthless. I enunciated the word. You said I was a waitress dragging you down. You threw my belongings on the lawn. You slammed the door in my face. You took the wedding ring off my finger because you said I did not deserve to wear it. Jason flushed a deep crimson. He looked at his feet. I was angry, Sarah. I told you. No. I cut him off. You were not angry. You were honest. I took a step toward him. He actually took a step back. He was afraid of me. You showed me exactly who you are. You showed me that our marriage was nothing more than a transaction to you. I was a utility. I was a maid who paid the bills. And the moment you thought you were rich, you discarded me like a broken appliance. I felt a surge of power. It was intoxicating. It was the power of truth. Arthur saw who you really were. I continued. He watched you. He saw your greed, he saw your cruelty, and frankly, so did I. I just refused to admit it to myself for 15 years. I made excuses for you. I told myself you were just stressed. I told myself you were just ambitious. But you are neither of those things, Jason. I let the silence hang for a beat. You are just small. Jason's face contorted. The mask of the loving husband fell away completely. Behind it was panic and rage. This is not over, he sputtered. His voice rose to a shout. I will fight this in court. I will find a judge who sees through this. I will prove you manipulated him. You will not see a dime of this money. I will tie this up in probate for years. Mr. Sterling stepped forward. He moved between us. He was a wall of charcoal gray wool. Jason, Mr. Sterling said. His voice was low and dangerous. I strongly advise against making threats in my office. Jason turned on him. You are in on it. You helped her steal my inheritance. Mr. Sterling adjusted his cuffs. He looked bored. Your father's will is ironclad. I drafted it myself. I have the video evidence of his competency. I have the witness statements. Any attempt to contest this will result in immediate dismissal, and it will result in expensive legal fees. Mr. Sterling paused. He looked Jason up and down. He looked at the expensive suit. He looked at the manicured hands. Fees that you can no longer afford. The reality of the statement hit Jason like a physical slap. He had $5,000. That would not even buy an hour of a good lawyer's time. He was powerless. He was toothless. Mr. Sterling walked to the door of the conference room and held it open. I suggest you focus on finding employment instead, Mr. Sterling said. The job market is competitive, and with your resume gap, you will need to start looking immediately. Jason looked from the lawyer to me. He looked at the luxury of the room one last time. He looked at the life he had thought was his. Then he looked at me. Sarah, he whispered. It was a final desperate plea. Please, I have nowhere to go. I looked at him. I thought about the motel room I had slept in. I thought about the sandwich I had eaten for dinner. I thought about the fear of being homeless at 38. He had not cared where I went. He had not cared if I starved. I checked my watch. You have 30 days to vacate the house on Elm Street, I said. Mr. Sterling will handle the eviction notice if you are not out by then. You are kicking me out, Jason asked. He sounded shocked. It is my house, I replied, and I have a lot of cleaning to do. I turned my back on him. I sat down at the table and opened the folder Mr. Sterling had given me. I did not watch him leave. I heard his footsteps dragging on the hardwood floor. I heard Ryan whisper something urgent to him. I heard the heavy door close. The silence returned to the room. But this time it was not the silence of tension. It was the silence of peace. It was the silence of a storm that had finally blown itself out. I looked at Mr. Sterling. He was smiling. It was a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Well done, Sarah," he said quietly. Arthur would have been proud. I took a deep breath. I felt light. I felt clean. The marriage was over. The burden was gone. I was Sarah Harrison. I was the owner of a construction empire, and I was free. The heavy oak door clicked shut. The sound was final. It sealed away the noise of Jason's shuffling footsteps and the desperate whispers of his brother. The conference room was suddenly vast and quiet. The air conditioning hummed a low and steady note that sounded like peace. I sat at the mahogany table. My hands were resting on the cool wood. I felt a strange sensation in my fingertips. It was the absence of trembling. For 3 days, my body had been vibrating with the frequency of fear. Now, for the first time since the suitcase tumbled down the stairs, I was still. Mr. Sterling did not rush me. He stood by the window for a moment looking out at the gray city streets. He gave me the gift of privacy in a public space. He allowed me to process the magnitude of the earthquake that had just reshaped my world. Jason was gone. The threat was gone. The poverty that had terrified me in the motel room was gone. Mr. Sterling turned back to the table. He walked over to his briefcase. He withdrew one final item. It was a thick envelope made of heavy cream paper. It was sealed with red wax. On the front of the envelope, in shaky but determined handwriting, was a single name: Sarah. Mr. Sterling slid the envelope across the polished table. It moved with a soft hissing sound. It came to rest directly in front of my hands. "He wanted you to read this privately," Mr. Sterling said softly. His voice was gentle. It lacked the sharp legal edge he had used with Jason. "This is not a legal document, Sarah. This is not a will. This is a conversation between a father and a daughter. Take all the time you need. I will be in my office next door if you require anything." He nodded once. It was a gesture of respect. Then he turned and walked out of the room. He closed the inner door behind him, leaving me alone in the sanctuary of the law library. I stared at the envelope. I recognized the stationery. I recognized the wax seal. Arthur had an old brass stamp with the letter H on it. He used to use it for special occasions. He had used it for my birthday cards. He had used it for the Christmas checks he gave to the staff. Now he had used it to seal his final goodbye. My hands shook slightly as I picked it up. It was not the shaking of fear. It was the shaking of reverence. I broke the seal. The red wax cracked with a sharp snap. I unfolded the thick paper inside. The scent of pipe tobacco and old paper drifted up from the page. It was the scent of Arthur. It was the scent of home. "My dear Sarah," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then justice has been served, and Jason has received the shock he so richly deserved. I can only imagine the look on his face. I hope it was worth the price of admission." I smiled through my tears. I could hear his dry chuckle in the words. "I want you to know that my decision to make you my heir was not a punishment for Jason." The handwriting became firmer here. The ink was pressed deep into the paper, though he will surely see it that way. A man like Jason sees everything as a transaction. He thinks I took from him to give to you, but he is wrong. I did not take anything from him because he never earned anything to begin with. I traced the lines of ink with my fingertip. This bequest was a recognition of your true worth. You spent 15 years being undervalued and taken for granted by my son. You worked yourself to exhaustion to support a man who contributed nothing to your partnership. You cleaned his messes, you paid his debts, you soothed his ego, and you did it all without complaint. I paused. I looked up at the portrait of the stern judge on the wall. Arthur had seen it all. He had seen the late nights at the diner. He had seen the tears I hid in the shower. You cared for me in my final months with a tenderness that came from your heart, not from obligation. You are the daughter I never had, Sarah. You are the person most deserving of the life my money can provide. The daughter he never had. The words blurred before my eyes. I had always wanted a father who was proud of me. My own father had been distant and critical, but Arthur had adopted me in spirit long before he adopted me in his will. The letter continued on the second page. "I have one request. It is not a condition of the will. The money is yours to do with as you please. Buy a boat if you want, though I suspect you are smarter than that." I laughed aloud in the empty room. No, I would not be buying a boat. My request is this: use this gift to build the life you deserve, but also use it to help others find their own worth. There are many women out there, Sarah, women who are trapped in situations like yours, women who are financially dependent on men who do not respect them, women who stay because they cannot afford to leave. I suggest you consider establishing a foundation to help women in situations similar to what you have endured. Give them the key to their own door. I lowered the letter. The idea took root in my mind instantly. A foundation. A way to turn my pain into power for someone else. I thought about the $43 in my wallet. I thought about the terror of the motel room. I thought about the millions of women who did not have a wealthy father-in-law to save them. I could be that safety net. I could be the one who provided the lawyer or the deposit for an apartment or the tuition for a degree. I folded the letter carefully. I placed it back in the envelope. I put it in my purse next to the black notebook. I felt a profound sense of closure. The circle was complete. Theodore had not only secured my future, but he had validated every sacrifice I had made during my marriage. His final act had been one of justice. He had recognized true character over blood relations. I stood up. I walked to the window. The gray clouds were breaking apart. A shaft of pale sunlight was cutting through the gloom. It illuminated the wet pavement of the street below. The rain had stopped. I looked at my reflection in the glass. I saw the black dress. I saw the severe bun, but the eyes were different. They were not the eyes of a victim. They were not the eyes of a wife. They were the eyes of a CEO. They were the eyes of a philanthropist. I turned away from the window. I walked out of the conference room. I walked through the lobby with its expensive leather furniture. I walked past the receptionist who smiled at me with new respect. I pushed open the heavy front door and stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp and clean. It smelled of rain and wet earth. It smelled of new beginnings. I walked down the steps. I did not look for Jason's truck. I knew he was gone. I walked toward my battered sedan. It was still the same car with the dented bumper, but the woman unlocking the door was new. I was no longer Jason's discarded wife. I was the owner of Harrison Construction Company. I was the architect of my own destiny. I got into the car and started the engine. It roared to life. I put it in gear and drove away from the law office. I did not know exactly where I was going. Maybe I would go to a hotel. A real hotel with crisp white sheets and room service. Maybe I would go to a nice restaurant and order a meal that cost more than $5. It did not matter. The destination was not important. What mattered was that I was driving. I was in the driver's seat of my own life, and for the first time in 15 years, the road ahead was wide open. Epilogue. 6 months later, the autumn leaves were turning a brilliant shade of gold and crimson along the streets of Fort Wayne. The air was crisp and smelled of burning wood. I sat in the corner office on the top floor of the Harrison Construction Building. The desk was massive. It was the same desk Arthur had used for 40 years. I had kept his chair, but I had changed the upholstery to a soft cream leather. The office was brighter now. I had removed the heavy velvet drapes and let the sunlight flood in. I looked down at the documents spread out before me. They were the quarterly reports for the company. The numbers were good. In fact, they were better than good. Under the guidance of Robert Patterson, the foreman Arthur had trusted for 22 years, the company was thriving. Robert had been skeptical of me at first. He was a gruff man who had spent his life on construction sites. But when I showed up at the site at 6 in the morning wearing steel-toed boots and asking intelligent questions, he had softened. I was learning the business gradually, just as Arthur had hoped. I was not afraid to admit what I did not know, and I was not afraid to work hard to find the answers. I signed the final page of the report with a flourish. My signature had changed in the last 6 months. It was bolder. It took up more space. I set the pen down and picked up a different stack of papers. These were the incorporation documents for the Theodore Harrison Foundation for Women's Independence. I smiled as I read the mission statement. It was dedicated to providing financial and legal assistance to women escaping abusive or financially controlling relationships. We had already approved our first 3 grants. One was for a woman who needed a deposit for an apartment to leave a husband who controlled her paycheck. One was for a woman who needed a lawyer to fight for custody. And one was for a young mother who wanted to go back to nursing school. It was the most satisfying work I had ever done. Every check I signed felt like a high five to Arthur in heaven. I swiveled my chair to look out the window. The city of Fort Wayne was busy below me. Somewhere in that city, Jason was living a very different life. The aftermath of the will reading had been swift and devastating for him. He had tried to contest the will, of course. He had found a shady lawyer who was willing to take his $5,000 to file a motion, but Mr. Sterling had been right. The will was ironclad. The court reviewed Arthur's psychiatric evaluation. They reviewed the video testimony. They listened to the witness statements about Jason's behavior at the funeral and his treatment of his dying father. The judge had dismissed the case with prejudice. He had even reprimanded Jason's lawyer for wasting the court's time. The defeat was total, and it was public. The story had spread through Fort Wayne like wildfire. Small towns love a scandal, and this was a juicy one. The story of the arrogant son who celebrated too early and lost everything to the wife he called worthless became the favorite topic of conversation at every diner and country club in town. Jason's reputation was permanently destroyed. He was no longer the golden boy. He was the laughingstock. His friends, the ones who had cheered him on when he talked about buying yachts, had vanished the moment the money did. They did not want to be associated with a loser. They did not want to buy drinks for a man who lived in his mother's basement. That was where he was now. With no employable skills after years of depending on others and a resume that showed a 15-year gap of laziness, he had been forced to move into the basement apartment of his mother's house. I heard through the grapevine that he was working part-time at a hardware store stocking shelves. I heard he was bitter. I heard he blamed everyone but himself. But I did not care. I did not hate him anymore. Hate requires energy. And I had better things to do with my energy. I had a company to run. I had a foundation to build. I had a life to live. I looked at the photo on my desk. It was a picture of Arthur and me on the back porch. He was frail in the wheelchair, but he was smiling. I was standing next to him with my hand on his shoulder. We looked like a team. We looked like family. The revenge was complete. But it had not been achieved through screaming matches or slashed tires. It had been achieved by simply allowing the truth to come to light. The best revenge had been allowing Jason to reveal his true character while Arthur watched and judged accordingly. Jason had dug his own grave with his greed. I had just planted flowers on top of it. I stood up and walked to the coat rack. I put on my trench coat. I had a meeting with the board of directors for the foundation at noon. Then I was meeting Robert at a new job site. It was a busy day. It was a productive day. I walked out of the office. I passed the receptionist. "Good afternoon, Miss Harrison," she said brightly. "Good afternoon," I replied. I walked down the hallway. My heels clicked on the floor. It was the sound of purpose. It was the sound of a woman who knew exactly where she was going. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors closed, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall. I winked at myself. The waitress was gone. The worthless woman was a myth. Sarah Harrison was just getting started. Lesson learned. True power does not roar, it endures. Sarah's journey teaches us that dignity and integrity are currencies far more valuable than gold, and unlike money, they cannot be stolen. While betrayal may strip a woman of her home or her status, it cannot strip her of her worth. The ultimate revenge is not to stoop to the level of the oppressor, but to rise so high that their cruelty can no longer reach you. In the end, character is destiny. Jason's greed became his prison while Sarah's kindness became her kingdom.